The temperature outside is 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Ray Kowalski is on his knees in the gravel, pressing the flat of his palm against a wall made of cardboard. Not patting it, not testing it the way you test something you weren't sure about, pressing it, feeling what's happening inside it. The way a doctor listens with a stethoscope, deliberate, unhurried, reading something invisible. The cardboard is double-walled, corrugated. He pulled it from behind the big box store 4 blocks east, the kind used for appliances, washing machines, water heaters, thick as a man's thumb and stiff as plywood in the right conditions. He's cut it into panels. Each panel is 24 inches wide, 36 inches tall. He has 16 of them, stacked and layered in a way that nobody walking past would immediately understand, because it doesn't look like insulation. It looks like garbage. That's the point, in a way. Nobody steals garbage. The shelter is taking shape inside the frame of a 3-man dome tent he found at an estate sale for $4. The tent itself won't hold warmth, single-layer nylon, breathable, nearly useless in a serious cold. But Ray isn't relying on the tent. The tent is just a skeleton. What he's building inside it, pressed against the inner surface, is something else entirely. The air smells like iron and old exhaust. Somewhere 2 blocks south, a freight train idles, its diesel engine a low mechanical pulse you feel more than hear. Ray's breath comes in small white clouds. His fingertips are numb from the gravel cold and the cardboard handling, but his hands are still working. They've been working for 40 years. The cold hasn't stopped them yet. From the edge of the lot, a man named Terrell watches from his own setup, a sleeping bag inside a shopping cart shelter covered with a blue poly tarp. Terrell has been at this camp for 7 months. He's seen people try things. "Ray," he calls over, "man, what are you doing with all that box?" Ray doesn't look up. "Insulating." Terrell is quiet for a moment. Then he laughs. Not mean, but the way you laugh at something that doesn't make sense yet. "Brother, that's cardboard. Rain is gonna eat that in a week." Ray presses his palm against the panel again. "Not if I do it right." Terrell shakes his head and pulls his tarp tighter. "All right," he says. "All right, man." He's still chuckling when he turns away. Raymond Kowalski grew up in Lorain, Ohio, 25 miles west of Cleveland on the southern shore of Lake Erie. His father worked at the steel mill. His uncle worked at the steel mill. Ray worked the steel mill for exactly 2 years before a foreman named Dennis Gruber told him he was too smart for the floor and ought to go to trade school. He did HVAC and refrigeration, 2 years at Lorain County Community College. He graduated in 1992 and went to work for a commercial heating and cooling firm in Toledo that serviced industrial accounts, factories, warehouses, distribution centers. He was good at it immediately, not just competent, genuinely good the way some people are with engines or languages or soil. He understood heat the way other people understand money, intuitively, practically, always thinking 3 steps ahead. He spent 22 years at that company. He married a woman named Carol in 1998. They had 1 daughter, Brianna, born in 2001, studying nursing in Columbus at the time of this story. Ray and Carol divorced in 2014, not bitterly, just finally, after years of distance built from opposite schedules and conversations that stopped going anywhere. He kept the apartment. He kept the truck. He kept working. In 2017, the firm lost its 2 largest contracts, a regional distribution warehouse and a food processing facility, both of which moved operations to Tennessee. The company cut 16 field technicians. Ray was the 14th name on the list. He was 51 years old, had a journeyman's license, 2 decades of field experience, and found himself in a hiring market that wanted younger technicians willing to work for $18 an hour instead of the $31 he'd earned. He applied to 41 positions over 8 months, 3 interviews, 0 offers. His savings lasted 14 months. He had $22,400 set aside, which sounds like a lot until you're paying $875 a month in rent and the job isn't coming. He sold the truck at month 10 for $4,200. That bought him 2 more months in the apartment. When the apartment was finally gone, he stayed with a co-worker named Phil for 6 weeks, then with his cousin Danny and Mommy for another month. Then Danny's wife asked, very politely, for a timeline. Ray didn't have one. He packed a duffel bag and left. The first night he slept rough was October 3, 2018. He slept under the Maumee River pedestrian bridge on a collapsed box he'd folded flat. The temperature dropped to 41 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd been colder on job sites, he told himself that. He moved to the encampment off Bancroft Avenue in Toledo that November, the largest informal camp in the city at the time, between 20 and 30 residents depending on the season. tucked between a chain-link fence and a concrete retaining wall along a stretch of industrial property nobody seemed to be actively managing. There was a portable toilet, a church group service twice a week, a community propane burner someone had bolted to a shopping cart, and an unspoken social order, norms about space and noise and whose food was whose, that Ray learned within his first 2 weeks. He set up his tent in the northeast corner of the lot, against the concrete wall which faced south. He'd chosen that corner deliberately. The south-facing wall was the first thing he'd noticed. The wall ran for about 60 feet along the north boundary of the camp. Concrete block, 8 feet tall, the back face of what had once been a light industrial building. It faced south-southeast. In December, even in Ohio, that wall absorbed heat during daylight hours and held some of it past sundown. Not much, with some. Ray had worked around materials like this his whole career. He knew what thermal mass felt like at the end of the day. He also knew something about dead air. This is the principle that makes insulation work. Not just in buildings, but in down jackets, in double-pane windows, in the walls of commercial freezers he'd serviced for 2 decades. Moving air conducts heat away from a warm surface. Still air, trapped in small pockets, does the opposite. It holds. A single layer of corrugated cardboard is not a remarkable insulator, but corrugated cardboard has a specific physical property that most people don't think about. The flutes, the zigzag ridges inside the board, create dozens of small, sealed air pockets running the length of the sheet. Each one is its own tiny dead air space. Stack 2 sheets with a deliberate gap between them, and you double the effect. Add a reflective surface on the inside. Mylar emergency blankets, the thin foil kind available at any outdoor surplus sale for $1.89 each. And you stop the third method of heat loss, radiation. Your body radiates heat outward constantly, like a slow-burning coal. Reflect that radiation back toward the source, and the space around you stays warmer without burning a single extra calorie of fuels. Ray had applied all 3 of these principles in industrial settings for 22 years. He knew, with the quiet confidence of a man who has tested ideas against reality thousands of times, that the same physics keeping a walk-in cooler at 36 degrees Fahrenheit in a 90 degrees Fahrenheit warehouse could keep a sleeping human being alive at -3 degrees Fahrenheit. He just had to build it small enough to work on no budget. He started gathering materials in the first week of December. The appliance cardboard came first. He learned the big box store's delivery schedule within 3 days, showed up Tuesday and Friday mornings when the flat breaking happened, and was polite and consistent enough that the loading dock supervisor, a heavyset man who went by G, started setting the best pieces aside. Ray tested each panel for moisture damage before taking it. Wet cardboard was useless. It would trap humidity and destroy his interior air quality. The Mylar blankets he bought with $6 he'd made helping a neighbor load a moving truck. 3 blankets, $2 each, from a surplus tent sale 2 blocks from camp. He also found, in a construction dumpster 3 streets over, a partial roll of heavy-gauge polyethylene sheeting, the kind used under concrete slabs as a vapor barrier. 4 feet wide, about 30 feet remaining. He cut it into panels for his outermost weather layer. He brought everything back in careful loads. He didn't rush. He thought through each step before he moved. But the second day of gathering, people had started to notice. Terrell watched Ray trim panels with a box cutter on that second afternoon. "You put cardboard inside a tent," he said. "I've seen that. Guy did that 2 winters ago. Works for maybe 2 weeks before the moisture gets in and it turns to mush." "The moisture is the problem to solve," Ray said, "not the cardboard." Terrell watched a moment longer. Then he went back to his own camp. There was also a woman named Patricia, Pat, who was 57, a former home health aide from Findlay, who had come to Toledo after her landlord sold her building and the replacement rent was $400 more than her income could handle. Pat was small and direct, with a gentle bluntness that made it hard to be angry at her. She sat down on an overturned milk crate and said, "Ray, I'm not laughing at you, but I've seen men spend 2 weeks building something out here and have it collapse in the first hard rain. I just want you to know what you're doing before you do it." Ray set down his panel. "Pat, you know what R value is?" She shook her head. "It measures how much a material resists heat passing through it. Your body generates about 80 watts of heat at rest. That's enough to heat a small, well-insulated space indefinitely. I'm building a space insulated well enough to hold that heat." He picked the panel back up. "I know what I'm doing." Pat looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "You need anything?" That question was the beginning of something. The third voice belonged to a younger man named Devin, maybe 28, who had arrived in October with a combination of energy, charm, and an expensive sleeping bag rated to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Devin thought the whole project was genuinely funny and said so freely. "You're building a box inside a box," he said. "That's a coffin, man. I'm not sleeping in a coffin." He said it without cruelty. Ray smiled at it. Devin would be one of the first people knocking at the shelter door in January. If you want to find out what Ray built inside that tent and what happened the night the temperature dropped to -3 degrees Fahrenheit in Toledo, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Raymond Kowalski built in that parking lot off Bancroft Avenue is a story about what knowledge does to a man when everything else has been stripped away. It doesn't leave, it stays, and sometimes it saves lives. Ray started construction on December 9th. He had set himself a deadline. December 21st, the solstice, the longest night of the year. He wanted to be inside a finished system before that night. The tent frame was a standard 3-pole dome, roughly 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 4 feet tall at the apex. He had repaired 2 broken pole sections with electrical conduit from the construction dumpster, wrapped tightly with duct tape at the joints. The rainfly, a separate outer layer, was still largely intact. That fly created the first dead air gap, about 3 inches wide between the fly and the tent body. Ray left it exactly as it was already doing part of the work. The next layer in was the polyethylene sheeting. He cut it into sections that covered the tent body's inner surface like wallpaper floor to ceiling, overlapping at the seams by 4 inches. This was his vapor barrier. Its job was to stop moisture from migrating inward from his breath and saturating the cardboard layers behind it. Moisture was the enemy, not cold. Cold he could fight. Wet cardboard in the sealed space would turn his shelter into a mold incubator within 2 weeks. Behind the polyethylene, going outward, came the first cardboard layer. He oriented every panel with the flutes running vertical, standing on end, not lying flat. In industrial pipe insulation, horizontal air pockets compress slowly under gravity. Stand them vertical, and the cells stay open. The dead air stays trapped. He cut each panel to fit the curved tent wall using a box cutter and a straight edge fashioned from a scrap of aluminum flashing. Every seam between panels was taped. No gaps. Gaps were thermal bridges, pathways for heat to escape. He spent the first 2 days on this layer alone. His hands became raw from the cardboard handling. By the end of day 2, the knuckle of his right index finger had opened into a shallow cut from a panel edge. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working. The second cardboard layer went up on day 3, offset from the first by half a panel width, staggered like bricklayers stagger courses, so no seam aligned between layers. Between the 2 layers, he maintained a deliberate gap of 3/4 of an inch using small cardboard spacers he'd cut and glued in place. 3/4 of an inch was not accidental. In commercial refrigeration, the optimal dead air gap for a still air thermal barrier falls between 1/2 inch and 1 inch. Beyond 1 inch, convection currents form and start carrying heat. Below 1/2 inch, the gap is too narrow for a fully still air column. 3/4 of an inch was the sweet spot. He had measured it professionally, dozens of times. The mylar went on last on the interior surface. 3 emergency blankets cut and laid flat, silvered side inward, facing the sleeping space, facing him. Their job was simple. His body would radiate heat in the infrared spectrum, and the mylar would reflect a significant portion back rather than letting it be absorbed by the wall. In commercial applications, reflective radiant barriers recover 25 to 40% of radiated heat. In a small enclosed space, the effect was proportionally greater. The floor was 3 layers of cardboard laid flat, covered by a foam sleeping pad from a church outreach team. Over that went his sleeping bag, a 3-season bag rated to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. For the first time since he'd been outside, he would be sleeping inside a system, not just a bag, not just a tent, but a complete thermal envelope, engineered from first principles. On December 14th, day 6 of the build, he hit the first serious problem. Fitting the second cardboard layer along the sloped rear wall of the tent, the dome's curvature created a gap he hadn't fully anticipated. About 18 inches wide at the base where the tent wall angled sharply inward and the flat panels couldn't conform without leaving a triangular void at the bottom. A gap that size would act as a thermal drain. The whole assembly would bleed heat through that one uninsulated section. He sat with the problem for most of the morning. Curved cuts were risky, limited material, ragged edges that wouldn't seal. Loose scraps would compress and shift, creating unpredictable voids. What he arrived at was a technique from pipe insulation work, the wrap. He cut narrow strips of cardboard 4 inches wide, full length, and rolled them into tight cylinders, each secured with a rubber band salvaged from a produce bundle. He packed these cylinders into the gap along the tent's base curve, like caulking a pipe joint with a flexible gasket. They conformed to the shape, they filled the void, and because each cylinder was a rolled tube of fluted board, every one contained its own internal dead air column. He tested the repair by holding a lit match near the gap's former location. The flame stood straight, no draft, the gap was gone. The second setback came on December 17th. He woke to condensation on the interior of the polyethylene barrier, small beads collecting along the lower sections where his breath had settled. Expected and manageable in itself, but when he checked the lower margin of the first cardboard layer, moisture had wicked upward along the edge, contacting the tent floor. A 2-inch section had softened. He removed the panel, let it dry in the weak December sun, then resealed its base edge with a double layer of polyethylene tape before reinstalling it. He also added a narrow strip of foam weather stripping, the peel and stick type, purchased for $2.47 from a hardware surplus bin, along the base perimeter of every panel. A moisture break between the cardboard edge and the floor. He would not have this problem again. On December 18th, a man named Walter appeared at his tent. Walter Hayes was 67, retired, and not a resident of the Bancroft camp. He lived in a small apartment 12 blocks away and came to camp 3 mornings a week with a breakfast outreach organization, a 2-wheeled cart loaded with coffee, and a 10-gallon percolator and bakery donations. He had been doing this for 6 years and had seen every kind of shelter improvisation a person could build in an urban camp. He stopped at Ray's tent and studied the layering for a long time without speaking. Then he crouched at the entrance and looked more carefully. Walter had spent 11 years before retirement as a building materials supplier, specifically insulation and vapor barrier products for commercial contractors. He knew exactly what he was looking at. "Your seams," he said finally. Ray looked at him. "The tape on your vapor barrier seams." Standard duct tape loses adhesion below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature drops hard, your seams start to release. Walter reached into the cart's lower shelf and produced a roll of tape, silver, wider than standard duct tape, different texture. HVAC foil tape, rated to -65. "It'll hold." Ray took the roll, nearly full, $14 worth of professional-grade tape used on industrial duct seams. He'd used thousands of linear feet of it over his career. "How'd you know what I was doing?" Ray asked. "Because I sold the materials for what you're doing for 11 years, Walter said. "Just never seen anyone do it with this." He tapped the cardboard. "What's your R value estimate?" "Per layer, the double-wall corrugated runs R2.5 to R3, Ray said. 2 layers with the dead air gap gets me to around R7. Add the reflective barrier and the foam floor pad and I'm probably at an effective R9, maybe R10 for the sleeping zone." Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's better than some walls I've sold," he said. He came back the next 2 mornings. He didn't do the work for Ray. He stood near the entrance, answered questions when Ray had them, drew a measurement correction in the gravel when Ray was calculating reflective barrier overlap. On the second morning, he brought 2 additional Mylar blankets from the surplus store. He pressed them into Ray's hands and said nothing about the cost. Walter had lost his wife in 2019 to a fast-moving pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He'd started the breakfast route the following spring because he needed somewhere to go in the mornings. He never said this to anyone at the camp. He didn't say it to Ray either, but something in the way he showed up, steady, quiet, practical, bringing what he had, spoke a language that Ray, who had also learned to keep grief moving forward, understood without words. By December 20th, the shelter was complete. Ray's hands had new calluses on the inside of both index fingers from the box cutter work. His right shoulder ached from the overhead panel installation. He'd lost what felt like 4 or 5 pounds from the combination of cold exposure, physical labor, and the low-grade hunger that becomes a background noise after a while. He sat outside the finished shelter for a few minutes in the gray afternoon light. It looked like a tent covered in cardboard. It looked exactly like what it was. He went inside. If you have ever felt invisible, truly invisible, the kind where people look right at you and see nothing worth paying attention to, consider subscribing and staying connected with this community. Because Raymond Kowalski built something that the city of Toledo would eventually have to pay attention to, and the reason it matters is not just the temperature inside. It is what it means when a person proves, quietly and precisely and with their own hands, that they were never nothing. Connection is its own kind of shelter. December 20th, 11:47 p.m. Ray Kowalski is lying in his sleeping bag inside his shelter in the northeast corner of the Bancroft camp. Outside, the temperature has dropped to 17 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no wind. A still, clear Lake Erie night, the kind where cold settles in layers and the stars are sharp and close. He has a small digital thermometer with a wire probe threaded through the tent wall. Sensor outside, readout inside. He bought it at a pawn shop in November for $8. Outside, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. He checks the interior sensor near his chest level. Interior, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. He reads it twice, then a third time, a 44-degree differential. On the first night, with his body as the sole heat source, no fire, no electricity, no combustion of any kind. He waits 20 minutes, check again. Interior, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 16 degrees Fahrenheit. 63 degrees warmer inside than outside. He lies on his back and looks at the silver mylar ceiling 4 feet above him, dimly reflecting his own shaped back. There is no sound from inside. The corrugated walls have a mild acoustic damping effect. The freight train, the highway trucks, the wind starting to stir. All of it comes through muffled and soft as if turned down. It is the quietest place he has been in 14 months. He doesn't cry. He almost does. Something shifts behind his eyes and his throat tightens and he breathes carefully through it. He thinks about the warehouse in Perrysburg where he'd retrofitted a full floor of pipe insulation in January 2009, 40-foot runs of lagged pipe, dead of winter, working in gloves. His foreman Birch had looked at the post-installation readings and said simply, "You're good at this, Kowalski." The highest praise Birch was capable of. He thinks about that now. The numbers came out right, because the principles were right. The principles were his. Nobody had taken them. He goes to sleep at 12:23 a.m. He sleeps until 6:47 a.m. He does not wake once from cold. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 13 degrees Fahrenheit by 4 a.m. January 13th through January 20th brought to Toledo what meteorologists would later call a polar vortex extension, a prolonged displacement of Arctic air that settled over the Great Lakes region for 7 consecutive days. The National Weather Service issued an extreme cold warning for the Toledo metropolitan area. Temperatures between 5 degrees Fahrenheit and 14 degrees Fahrenheit each night. Wind chills reaching minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the second and third nights when a northwest wind arrived. Warning period, 7 days. In the camp off Bancroft, people read the forecast on phones, on posted flyers through the window of a laundromat 2 blocks away. Terrell added a second blue poly sheet to his tarp setup, held down with stacked bricks. Devin checked the rating on his sleeping bag for the 4th time. A woman in the camp's eastern corner named Rosa, 62, originally from Sandusky, had been sleeping in a sleeping bag inside a cardboard box inside a donated gazebo tent. The setup had worked adequately through December, but her cardboard was already showing moisture damage along the lower sections. The city's warming shelters opened early. The nearest one, a community center 7 blocks from camp, had capacity for 40 people. By the afternoon of January 13th, it held 38 with a waiting list. A church hall 4 miles north was at capacity by 6 p.m. A third overflow location, a gymnasium at a community college, activated on January 14th, 2 days ahead of schedule. January 13th brought a high of 18 degrees Fahrenheit and a low of 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds at 12 miles per hour made the felt temperature 6 degrees Fahrenheit below zero by midnight. Ray checked his thermometer at 9 p.m. Outside, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. The system was performing above his original estimates. He attributed it to slight compaction of the second cardboard layer over 3 weeks. As the fluting settled, the dead air spaces had become more uniform and the insulation had actually improved. He made a note on a piece of folded paper he kept in his jacket pocket, the same pocket where he'd kept work notes for 22 years. January 14th, the wind arrived from the northwest at 18 miles per hour. Temperature dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 a.m. and did not rise above 14 degrees Fahrenheit the following day. Wind chill recorded at minus 16 degrees, 5 for the morning report. Schools close in 6 counties. The city emergency line received 214 calls in 24 hours. At 11:15 p.m. on January 14th, Terrell knocked on Ray's tent. Ray heard it, deliberate, not frantic. He unzipped the inner flap and looked out. Terrell was standing in the full weight of the wind, his tarp visible 30 feet behind him, one corner already ripped loose and snapping. His face was flat and serious. No apology in his expression, but an honesty, a directness. The face of a man asking for something real. "It's bad out here," Terrell said. "I've slept rough in bad cold before. This is different." "Get in," Ray said. That was all that was said. The shelter was designed for one occupant, but the physics improved with two heat sources in the same volume. By midnight, the interior temperature had risen to 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the wind chill had dropped to -19 degrees Fahrenheit. Ray didn't mention the cardboard comet. Terrell didn't mention it either. They slept side by side on the foam pad with their sleeping bags spread over both of them, and the shelter held, and the wind whirked at the rainfly without finding any way in. On January 15th, Devin came early in the evening with his expensive sleeping bag tucked under his arm and a slightly sheepish expression. "It's cold out there," he said simply. Ray moved to make room. On January 16th, the night the temperature hit -3 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest recorded in Toledo that winter. 4 people were inside the shelter: Ray, Terrell, Devin, and Rosa, whose gazebo tent had partially collapsed under the wind. Ray had seen the situation, walked across the camp, and told her to come over. He didn't ask, he just said it. 4 adults, 7 feet by 5 feet, R9 insulation on every surface. At 2 a.m., with the official air temperature at -3 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind chill beyond what the NWS station calculated, the interior temperature was 74 degrees Fahrenheit. The differential that night was 77 degrees. On January 17th, a man named Gerald, who lived in a camp under a highway overpass 2 miles from Bancroft, was found unresponsive by a passerby at approximately 5 a.m. He was 48 years old. He was transported to a hospital, where he later died of hypothermia. He had been sleeping without adequate shelter in the -3 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. His death was reported in the local paper in a 7-line notice on page 4. Gerald had not been at the Bancroft camp. Ray had never met him. But when Ray heard about it from Pat, on the morning of January 18th, he sat down on a milk crate in the cold and was quiet for a long time. He had built this system, he had proved it worked, and there was a man dead 2 miles away who might not have died if he'd known what corrugated cardboard and dead air and a $1.89 Mylar blanket could do. He thought about that for a long time. The polar vortex extension ended on January 20th. The temperature climbed back above freezing for the first time in 7 days on the afternoon of January 21st. People emerged from warming shelters and cars and corners, and the camp off Bancroft had a different texture to it now, a different set of conversations. Terrell came to Ray on January 22nd with a cup of coffee from Walter's morning cart. He sat down, handed it over, and said, "Explain the cardboard thing to me, from the beginning." It wasn't a casual curiosity. He wanted to understand. He listened for 45 minutes as Ray walked through every layer: vapor barrier, dead air, Mylar, R-value math. He asked specific questions. He took nothing for granted. Devin showed up with a composition notebook and asked Ray to draw it out. Ray spent an afternoon making diagrams, cross-sections, material labels, measurements. Devin studied the drawings the way someone studies a map of a place they're about to go. Pat came with more practical questions. "What does this cost if you have $30? Ray thought carefully and wrote her a specific list. The materials, where to find them, what to prioritize when money was tight. She folded the list into her coat and kept it. On January 28th, a young woman named Clara Osgood arrived at the camp. She was a graduate student in urban planning at the University of Toledo, writing her thesis on informal settlement resilience strategies in post-industrial Midwestern cities. She had heard, through a social worker at the downtown community resource office, about the shelter system at the Bancroft camp. People who had survived 7 days of polar vortex without electricity, without commercial heating equipment, without fire. She sat with Ray for 3 hours. She photographed the shelter with his permission and recorded his explanation of the thermal principles. She asked good questions, the kind that showed she understood what she was hearing. At the end, she asked if he'd be willing to talk to her thesis advisor, a professor in the engineering department who worked on low-cost, sustainable building. Ray agreed. Within 4 weeks, his material list and construction diagram had been shared with 3 other camps in Toledo and through Clara's network with encampments in Cleveland, Dayton, and eventually Cincinnati. The diagram passed through human transmission, photographed, redrawn, described in texts and conversations, adapted by each person to their specific situation. Some adaptations were more effective than others, but the core principle traveled intact: dead air, vapor barrier, reflective surface. The triangle, Ray's triangle, he sat in front of a shelter on a February afternoon. The week Clara's thesis advisor came to visit and looked at the concrete wall to the north of the camp, still facing south, still absorbing whatever thin winter sunlight Ohio had to offer. He thought about his father in the steel mill, and Dennis Gruber telling him to go to trade school, and Birch saying you're good at this in a cold warehouse in 2009. He thought about the 4 people who had slept in this space at -3 degrees Fahrenheit and were alive and fine. He was still homeless. He had no timeline on that changing, no fairy tale resolution waiting around the corner. What he had was this: a corner of a gravel lot against a south-facing wall, a system built with $14 and found materials and 22 years of knowledge, and the quiet certainty of a man who has proved to himself precisely and completely that what he knows is real. As of the time the story was reported, Raymond Kowalski was still living in the Bancroft camp, entering his 3rd winter there. He had been connected, through Clara's thesis work and the university's outreach program, with a nonprofit housing organization working to find him a transitional housing placement. There was no firm date. There rarely is. His shelter had been rebuilt twice, once when a spring storm destroyed the tent frame, once when he upgraded the vapor barrier system based on a refinement he'd thought through over the summer. Each rebuild was better than the last. He had the diagrams in his head now. He didn't need the paper. The thermal principle he documented, layered corrugated insulation with deliberate dead air gaps and a reflective inner lining, had been adapted and described in Clara's published thesis, presented at a regional conference on urban housing resilience, and referenced in 2 separate nonprofit guides on low-cost emergency shelter modification. His name appears in the acknowledgments: Raymond Kowalski, HVAC technician, Toledo, Ohio. Terrell built his own version for the following winter. He slept warm. Devin built one and then built 2 more for other people in the camp. He charged nothing. He just built them. Walter still comes with his coffee cart 3 mornings a week. He and Ray talk about the weather, temperature trends, what's coming off the lake, what the sky looked like at dawn. They are, in the wordless way of people who respect each other's knowledge, friends. There is a temptation at the end of a story like this to make it about triumph, to say that Ray won. But the more honest thing is this: Ray never lost the knowledge. Every pipe run he insulated, every R-value he calculated, every dead air gap he engineered into a warehouse wall, all of it survived. The job ended. The apartment ended. The truck ended. But the understanding of how heat moves and how to stop it stayed in his hands and his head, waiting. Knowledge is not a credential. A credential can be revoked, can expire, can become worthless in a market that changes its mind. Knowledge is different. It lives in the body. It persists. There are people around you, in a camp, in a car, in a shelter, who carry knowledge exactly like Ray's: structural knowledge, medical knowledge, agricultural knowledge, engineering knowledge. Knowledge the economy has no current use for, and so the economy has moved on and left the person behind. What Ray's story asks quietly, without preaching it, is this: when you see someone building something from cardboard in a parking lot at 11 p.m., what do you assume about what they know? What do you assume about any of us before we've had a chance to show you what the numbers say? If you stayed with this story to the end, that means something. It means you're the kind of person who believes a story about a man in a gravel parking lot with a box cutter and some cardboard is worth your full attention, and you were right. There's another story on this channel waiting for you right now. Another person who took everything the world taught them and used it to survive conditions that would have stopped most people cold. These stories exist because the people in them deserve to be heard with the same care they brought to staying alive. Consider staying. Until next time, thank you for watching.